Hi, my name is Joe Davis McElligott. And I want to thank you all so much. One second, I'm sorry. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time and energy to ask me such interesting, engaging, and important questions. I wish that I had time to answer every single one of them, but I'm going to try to do my best to answer, as many as I can. I'm going to talk for maybe 30 minutes. So I wanted to begin by saying the first question is, do you believe Conjure is real? And I actually would say, yeah, I do believe that Conjure is real. I think it's real as any other faith custom is real. I say this because for many years I taught in Louisiana, and I taught in Cajun and Creole country in Louisiana. And while I was there, I discovered that people were practicing conjure. They were practicing root work in very, very real ways. One of the major ways is, I'll give you an example, a gree-gree, Gris dash Gris. A gree-gree is a charm bag. I have one that a student gave me to ward against harm. These are made by specialists who commune with the natural world, who commune with the spirit world, and give you wards of protection. They can also, as I discuss in my essay, cause harm if the spirits allow it. Part of what is important about conjure justice is that the giving or the causing of harm is always mitigated by a number of different circumstances. It's mitigated by the spirits who allow the harm to be caused. It's mitigated by the root worker who agrees to cast the curse. And then it also involves the community and the cursed person themselves. It involves the person who asks for this. Another example I would give you, it's still set in Louisiana, and it still involves root work, is the film Eve's Bayou. I don't know if any of y'all have seen that movie. In Eve's Bayou, a little girl goes to a root worker. She wants to kill her father. She finds out that her father has been abusing her sister, and she wants him gone. The root worker, the conjurer, agrees, communes with the spirits, and her father dies. And one thing that the main character has to grapple with is the consequences of those decisions and the impact that it has on her community. Another thing that they practiced in South Louisiana was a traiteur. And a traiteur is a folk healer. They practice, they will pray to the saints, they'll pray to the Loa, they'll pray to the Orisha, they'll make you poultices, they'll make you teas. They work on physical and soul injuries. So if you're feeling depressed or if you have the flu, you could go to a traiteur. I found when I was in South Louisiana, and that's where Sing and Buried Sing is set, that this was a very common folk practice. People did believe it. They were practicing it. And to that extent, I think that it's important to think of these African-derived religions as having the kind of weight in the world that maybe we would accord Catholicism or Islam. Another question that these are like two questions that I would go together. How does conjure apply to the context of restorative justice, in your words? And how can we as a community make conjure justice a healing event? I feel like one of the things that I take away from conjure is its inclusion of all of the people in the community. As I mentioned before, it includes the person who causes harm, the person who receives, is the receiver of that harm. It involves a healer, perhaps, a counter curse. It involves the spirit world. It involves the community that these people are living in. It involves the Christian God in many instances. All of these people are involved. One of the consequences of incarceration is its isolation, its spiritual isolation, its physical isolation, the impossibility not just of making amends, but re-engaging in a community, participating in ordinary life, related living. One of the things that I like to show my students when we talk about abolition are past Truth and Reconciliation Councils. There was a famous one after the genocide in Rwanda, where the opposing groups were brought together. And in processes of truth and reconciliation, there's a lot, it's a communal event. It happens in public. The person who caused harm acknowledges that harm caused, and then they apologize. And in return, the person says, I hear that you caused the harm. I've accepted your apology, and now we're going to move together again in this community. And one of the things that my students cannot believe is, this person who's sitting next to me in church and eating dinner with me every week, now that we've moved from Truth and Reconciliation, cut my foot off and killed my husband and all of my children. Like, I don't understand. Their minds are blown. I don't understand how we could, how this is even real. And part of me finds that really sad in a way, right? Because I think that it is a sign, at least in the United States, at how far we are away from recognizing that people do not exist in a vacuum. They don't cause harm in a vacuum. Hurt people. That's a fact. Every single person alive hurts people. People do things out of desperation. They do things out of necessity. They do things, sure, sometimes just to be shitty or mean. But I think that the truth is so much more complicated than that. So one of the ways that I think of conjure is that in the way that I'm going to use this word imbricates, which is just a fancy word to say like draws all these people together. The way that it imbricates all of these different realms and modes of living in the world should be a model, I think, for how we think about what justice could look like, rather than isolating people, rather than having preset mandatory sentences or already coming into a justice situation without being able to listen to all of these different viewpoints, right? Including spiritual viewpoints. That's where I see conjure applying to the context of restorative justice, is offering us one such model or one way of thinking about how we can move beyond the incidents of harm caused into, new systems of living together again. So that's something that I think is hugely important. There's a question I just want to answer really quickly about Catholicism and animism and whether or not this is something that Jesmyn Ward herself believes. And actually, I found that Jesmyn Ward wrote this text with a familiarity, because she's from that part of the country, with the familiarity of these traditions, but doesn't really hold them herself. I think that's really fascinating, and also a testament to how beautiful her writing is, that you really get a sense of that. Okay, let me look at another one. Oh, I also wanted to know, as I mentioned before, that people in the rural South are still practicing conjuring these rituals of healing in very direct ways. If you were to Google Rootwork Louisiana, you can find shops all throughout New Orleans. You could look up a traiteur, Traiteur, and find lists of their services. And so one of the things that I think about these folk religions and these African-derived religions is that they are absolutely a very strong force in the world. A corollary to conjure is voodoo, and voodoo is practiced all throughout the Caribbean and in many places in the United States still. One question was about Philemon turning to away from African-derived religious practices toward modern-day medical treatment, and whether or not this is hypocritical of Philemon. I think in some ways we could think of conjure and root work as existing alongside, maybe not in opposition to, modern medicine. As Philemon says at the end of the novel, when, she asks, y'all, her name is escaping me. Leonie. Asks Leonie to call the Mystere and lead her toward death. That the body is not cooperating, right? That the spirit world willing to heal her, herself willing to be healed. The body, too sick, done. So I do think that, modern medicine has its place. And I do find it really interesting and important that conjure rests alongside as a supplement to, in conversation with, imbricated in these other forms of healing. This is a question about whether or not Richie, or whether or not Jesmyn Ward, I feel that she accomplished the goal of giving Richie power and freedom. I think yes and no. One thing that I do think is very important about literary art is that it allows us to imagine people's lives, a peek into existences that we maybe would never see. And one of the things about Richie is there were so many little boys, little girls, small children, mostly little boys, who were just completely lost in that system, who lost their lives, were never really mourned, were never really known, their stories just disappeared. And this is something that is of great interest to me in my research, is the way that Black writers in particular find ways through literary art to push back against that historical erasure. Some people may say, well, it's a story, it's not really real, it didn't really happen, you know. There are some really convincing arguments these days from scholars in Black study who argue that that act of imagination is just as valid as actual history work. So to that extent, I do feel that Jesmyn Ward does give Richie and us access to a story that otherwise, you know, maybe none of us would even know about, these little boys, these kids. At the same time, I feel like I read the ending as very hopeful. But one of the things that I've noticed is that that's not always the case. Some people do mount convincing arguments that at the end of the novel, Richie is still stuck. He still can't get home. And so, too, the same could be said for all of the ghosts in the tree that Jojo and Kayla see. So to some extent, I like to imagine and believe that Kayla's conjure song works, and Richie and all the other ghosts are ushered back home. And to some extent, that is a form of freedom. But I also recognize that alongside that freedom is the horrible burden and weight of trauma and grief and shame and anger and pain that I'm not sure that the text wants us to be free from. I think that part of the process of reading this book is confronting that is part of this experience also. This is a great question. Just to give a gloss, it says, given a powerful entrenched violent system determined not to change, would I go so far as to say that conjure justice infrastructures are the only realistic possibility for actual change? I wouldn't say the only viable possibility. However, I think that the modes of social interaction that conjure offers us are essential. I don't think that until we can begin, and this is my own personal opinion, until we can begin to really think about what it would mean to change everything and found a new society, and by that I mean eliminating poverty, a universal wage, universal health care, the end of food deserts, the end of racism, the end of sexism, patriarchalism, right? Now, this is like a really tall order. As you say, these are powerful, entrenched, violent systems that are also economically motivated. That said, I think about what Mariame Kaba argues, and I say this not to be depressing. It's something that I actually think about all the time, and it gives me a considerable amount of hope and strength. She explains and reminds us that some people were born into slavery and they died a slave. My great great grandpa was one such person. He was born a slave and he died a slave. And there's, you know, she argues that there's this, in a lot of abolitionist discourses, this desire to see everything come to fruition, right? This is probably going to sound like cold comfort, and I think it is in some ways, right? That we don't always get to see that there were generations of freedom fighters people pushing back against the institution of slavery, people escaping, people writing letters, people learning to read clandestinely, people forming new relationships, people continuing to learn, people continuing to shape the environments that they were in, building new communities, pushing toward new ideas. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think that, oppressed people, marginalized people can be so brilliantly important in our world, because of the powerful ways that they see through the veneer of what we call reality, right? So anyway, I think about Mariame Kopa's observation that some people will fight and resist and build community and push toward that eventual change, essential change, right? But they won't themselves live to see the end of that violent system. And so I try to think of, when I think about abolitionism, I try to think of it, and this is her metaphor for abolitionism, right? Not for slavery, which is that we work on these things now together in common, thinking these thoughts, building this community as we're, communicating with one another right now, introducing people to these ideas, continuing to address, as you say, it's the inherent violence of the system, the lack of good that it does to isolate people, the sort of the culture of revenge rather than, I don't even want to use the word rehabilitation, I want to use relation, right? I don't believe that conjure is the sole or singular way, but I do believe that the only way we get out of that is by reimagining the world and reimagining our relationship to one another, and then through the slow steps that it takes, putting that into action. I'm also sort of reminded, just now saying that, of what John Lewis argued, which is that, you have to constantly, continually increase that pressure. And so, one of the things that I love about abolitionist thought is introducing this concept to people that we can live in a world without prison. We can live in a world without isolating people. We do not need to continue to harm people in that way. It solves nothing. And so that's what I would say. Thank you so much for that really brilliant question. I think I've already answered this last question about how conjure could influence approaches to justice, especially in contexts where communities are recovering from historical trauma. And one of the things that I think is so important about conjure in particular is that it gives everybody that opportunity to communicate with one another. So you go to the root worker, they're an interlocutor for you and the person with whom you're having conflict. You go to the root worker, they also communicate with the spirit world on your behalf. There are things that the spirits will allow, and there are things that the spirits will not allow, and that is also part of how human beings are expected to operate within a conjure system of justice. Another important thing, I think, is that conjure, like abolitionism, I think is realistic, that harm, people are going to hurt each other, It's a fact. Thinking about how we respond to that, why people harm one another, and then what it means to heal from harm. Far more important and essential questions than how long can we put somebody in a prison cell away from the world. So that's what I would say. I think especially when it comes to historical trauma, conjure also offers something that a lot of Black people have been completely disconnected from, which is any sort of sense of a deep past, any kind of sense of ancestor worship. That's one of the things that's very important in African-derived religions and in many African nations and cultures, is a deep, intimate connection to the ancestor world. In the slave trade, a lot of that was cut off. All of that was cut off. Much of it was cut off from us and our ancestors. And so conjure offers people a way to reconnect with that system, which is its own sort of system of justice and belonging. Okay. This is an interesting question about how do you propose to break down a system as entrenched as the one we find ourselves in, and what system would you have us use? That's an excellent question, because this, you mentioned in this that there's a fraying, balanced system of government, a general decay. I would say that my way into this is through art. I would mention maybe somebody like Nicole Fleetwood, who is a scholar who her research involves visual art made by people in prison, some people on death row. One of the ways that I find actual resistance is by helping people rethink their relationship to the world through literary art. And I do think that Conjure offers us, new ways of thinking about our obligations to one another, our relationship to the natural world, our relationship to the spirit world, our relationship to our families, our relationship to ourselves. There needs to be, in my view, and something I love about Sing Unburied Sing is the way that it asks us to be responsible for one another in a really broad system of care that echoes out into infinity. I believe that we are not, disposable. Human beings are important and they matter. And so I would say that for me, I want to offer people an opportunity to think about why people matter, why their lives are important, even when they cause harm. And my lens is through art. I don't know that it's always the most perfect thing. But that's my strategy. So one of the questions is, what is a justice infrastructure? And I think a justice infrastructure looks like what you see. Well, we claim to have a justice infrastructure, right? Where, you get a lawyer, you go to court, you get sentenced, you go to jail, you serve your time, you get out, whatever. That's the justice infrastructure. I think Conjure offers another justice infrastructure where it's, like I said, more communal. You're required to cooperate with lots of different kinds of other people and entities in order to get things done, right? And also you're part of that infrastructure too. Nobody's being removed or taken out of it. Everybody's being gathered together. I actually feel like, to ask the question of what proper justice would be like for the family, in part, any acknowledgement of their pain. One of the terrible things about the book, it's really, really difficult to read, is the sort of perpetuation of the of Leonie's partner, whose name is escaping me all. I'm sorry. Joseph? I'm pretty sure it's Joseph. Yeah, Joseph. The way that his parents continue to ostracize and isolate Leonie and her children. The lack of, and maybe this is where, I find Truth and Reconciliation so fascinating, and why I find, that, Conjure Justice to be so fascinating, is the way that it asks people to imagine themselves responsible for speaking out loud in public, as a community, that this was a grievous injury, and we need to now move together as a community to solve that. But part of the difficulty in the novel is that we're dealing with a racist justice system, a racist cop, a racist town, a racist country, a racist history, right? And all of these forces, compound and compound and compound, and prevent that reconciliation from ever happening. So justice to me would have to look closer to some acknowledgement of the system of the harm done. Do I believe that restorative justice will be the primary form of healing and correction? I mean, I really, I guess in asking, I think the next breakthrough will be, I really hope that the next breakthrough would be helping people rethink our obligations to one another as people living on the planet. And one of the things that I love about Jesmyn Ward's vision is that they're relating to one another, but they're relating to one another through animals. They're relating to one another through the land. They're relating to one another through the Orisha, through the Loa, through the Catholic saints, through through God, through the universe, through the spirit world. less isolation, and then and a greater sense of our obligations to one another, right? What we can do for one another, how we can take care of one another. It's really difficult to be a human being, especially in the United States, which rewards individualism and isolation as almost goods, rather than systems that I think are actually designed to destroy. All right, I've been talking for quite some time. I'm not sure. I've been trying to answer everyone, but I'm gonna try to combine a few of these now. Do you feel that restorative justice can be equivalent to the rituals used in the novel to bring about balance? And what would it take to create a conjurer justice infrastructure that promotes healing yet avoids the mistakes of the past? I mean, one of the things that I love about conjurer justice is that because it involves and invokes the spirits, nothing can be done without their consent. And I think that one of the things that this fundamentally relies on is a sense of justice and belonging that is greater, an understanding of that is greater than what human beings bring to the table. Human beings, I love us, but we're flawed. And conjurer justice seeks to step in and say, hey, you've got to have an interlocutor here to help you make these decisions about how you're going to be in the world. I also like to think of conjurer justice as being, in large part, preventative, right? Like, its focus is not to wait until the harm has been caused. It's to prevent the harm from ever taking place in the first place. And that requires a great amount of communal work. So when I think about restorative justice, I do think about what do we do after the event when the harm has been caused, but then I think about the things that we need to do before. Is everybody hungry? Is everybody full? Does everybody have lights on in their house? Can everybody get to school okay? Does everybody's mom and dad have a job? Is everybody, did you get hugged today? Do you have a vision for yourself for the future? Do you have access to opportunities that you need in order to do those things? Those kinds of things I think also are really important. And I know that's one of the things where I look at Jojo and Kayla and the way that they are being mothered fairly shittily by Leonie. She's there, as Philemon reminds her, you're never going to find Leonie ever giving you more than what she can give you. And this is what she can give you. But there are other people, right? Jojo and Kayla for one another, Jojo and his entanglement with the natural world, Jojo and his grandfather, Jojo and his grandmother. We also don't really fully see, but he's got friends at school and a broader community, right? His grandpa's brother, for example, who's still in part of the community, other kids, other people that they know who could come to their aid if need be. Part of what I think about in avoiding the mistakes of the past is really making sure that we create communities that don't just reduplicate the conditions of harm or put pressure on families to do something that they can't do, or put pressure on people to be better than their environments, or to have to unilaterally claw their own way out, right? One of the things that I love about restorative justice is that it asks us to accept the fact that justice can only take place under certain conditions, certain lived conditions, and that those lived conditions have not yet been met. This is such a great question. Can River ever find peace with killing Richie? I know it is hard to live with killing someone on my soul. Is self-forgiveness possible? I actually believe that this novel and Conjure would argue that yes, self-forgiveness is absolutely possible. And that this is part of, as I was describing about truth and reconciliation, and part of what's at the root of restorative justice is having the opportunity to, and this is why I think our, Conjure justice offers such a powerful counter to the way things are, is that River does not have an opportunity. He tells his story and Richie is there, but they're separated. There's Jojo is the interlocutor there. He's the only one who can see them, right? He can see and he can know, and Richie can know, and Richie can see how much pain and sadness and grief and guilt and rage there is. At the same time, I like to believe that at the end of the text, when Given and Philemon and Richie and, everybody's, everybody's found their way back home, I like to imagine that River too, right, in his care for his children, his grandchildren, his continued love for Leonie, in spite of all of her flaws, his being there-ness, his immense love for Richie, and then also bearing in mind the hideous situation that River was in, where he had to make a decision like that, or did make a decision like that in the first place. I believe that these justice infrastructures and then also spiritual interventions are essential for learning how we can not just forgive ourselves for harm caused, but then also learn to heal in relation to one another. That's really what I feel like the real lesson of Sing and Buried Sing is. All right, I want to answer a couple more questions, and then I'm gonna let y'all go because I've just been chatting. Leonie responds to Michael by saying, "You ain't never known, and you go where you want." Is she referring to being a black female in the South, or having to raise biracial children in the South? I think that it's both. I think that Michael is his name, y'all. I was calling him Joseph. Michael is his name. Sorry about that. Yes, I think she's referring to both. One of the things about Michael and Leonie is that they're, kind of star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet style. At the same time, neither Michael nor Leonie have done the sort of work to reconcile that horrible pain. Michael's guilt and shame about his cousin having killed her brother, and then Leonie's guilt and shame at maybe betraying her brother's memory by being with him. At the root of this, though, is that there is a level of experience that Leonie and her children and her family experience as black people in the South that Michael will never understand. And you can absolutely see that in the way that his family responds to his family, to Joseph and his mother, right, when he shows up at the house and fisticuffs. Now, this is a fascinating question. Was Jesmyn Ward depicting Leonie as jealous and insecure? Did Jojo and his care for his sister and grandmother remind Leonie of what she wasn't capable of? When Leonie saw Jojo as a hungry girl, was she referring to her seeing herself? Yes, absolutely. All of that, I say, is absolutely the case. And one of the things that makes me the saddest when I read this book is thinking about Leonie's pain. Sometimes when I choose this book, and I'm always amazed to see my students really come through for Leonie and see the ways that she's suffering and the kinds of sadnesses that she carries with her, that make it difficult for her to mother, right? She desperately wants to be able to provide that kind of care for Jojo and Kayla, and she cannot do it right now. One of the things that I love about this book is that she's not extracized from the family, right? Philemon says practically, Jojo, Leonie can, she loves you, but this is what she's capable of giving you right now. You can't ask her to fill up the mother love. She doesn't have it in her right now. You can find that somewhere else. And I think that is a real challenge for Leonie, right? To see her children turn to one another in her absence. Unfortunately, it turns to spite, and meanness. And I also find that also to be very realistic, Nobody says that Leonie has to be a saint, right? People aren't perfect. They're not always nice and loving. And they still deserve to be in related living with people. They still deserve love and care from their families too. So at the very beginning, I think it's Jojo saying, "I like to think I know what death is. I like to think that it's something I could look at straight." Is the author talking about Given, Philemon, Richie, or all the men at Parchman? Or is it about looking death in the eye when you're dying? I want to suggest that it's closer to that last statement that you made. That it's more like looking at death in the eye when you're dying. I say this because I think that the novel, I really didn't pick up on this until the second or third time I'd read it. That Jojo can hear the voices of animals talking to him, right? Even little mosquitoes to big ones like horses. He can see this goat And we know that he can't stop it from coming to his head. If he runs into an animal, it's going to be communicating with him. At that point in the novel, we can almost be certain that Jojo is communicating with that goat, feeling that goat's comfort with River, because River also has the gift of making animals really comfortable around him, but perhaps also the fear, right? If Jojo can hear the goat's thoughts as though he were speaking right to him, what was the goat thinking or feeling or saying or communicating as it was dying? I find that to be an extraordinarily brave scene of Jojo. He goes there. He wants to be with his grandfather. His grandfather's making this great sacrifice, right? To kill this animal for his birthday, right? I mean, you can get a lot more out of a live animal than you can get out of a dead one. And, I think in spite of this, he also perceives Jojo living on a farm, that death is a natural part of the world around him, right? When he gets sick, right, he feels shame about that, right? That he's not yet able to be a man enough, right? But I think if you could parallel that to River having to kill Richie, or making the choice to kill him, I don't think we could say he has to kill him. There's a sort of echo, right, in that vulnerability and making that decision, right, to go along with something like a sacrifice like that. That's repulsive and yet logical in a way. I like to think of Jojo thinking about and coming to grips with what it means to have this gift, to live in a world where beings are living and dying all around him all the time, right? And I also want to note that Jojo eats that goat. He uses it to nourish his body. He eats leftovers of it. He takes it with him. He heats it up for breakfast. It's tasty. His grandpa cooked it. So I really also think about that too. That even in the midst of this terror, Jojo does bring Richie back to River. River does have the moment to tell the story. Richie does get sung back home. There's a kind of logic and balance to that, right? That I also think that Conjure is trying to encourage us to think about. A sacred ecological balance. And that we're part of that sacred balance too. We live in the world alongside all of this, in spite of these death-dealing, anti-Black violent systems that we find ourselves a part of. And then finally, you emphasize the role of the spiritual realm in shaping characters' experiences. How does the spiritual connection contribute to their healing process, and what lessons can be drawn from it in understanding the broader implications? I definitely, I'm going to just say my dad is a reverend, so I was raised in the Black church my whole life. And I've actually seen and believe very much that we exist on multiple different realms, right? I'm existing right here with you. I'm in Texas right now, talking, in my computer. I also believe, and as do conjure workers, that we exist as infinite beings in a cosmic spiritual realm. That this world is not, is that there's a veil, right? Just on the other side of it. Philemon says she knows that Given is right there. It's like she can almost see him. I think that thinking about the spiritual world as key to our healing process is so essential in Conjure, because you may die, you may get harmed, you may get killed. It is not the end. I think that is hugely important. Now, obviously, it doesn't give, it's about balance. So it doesn't just give you the, free reign to just do whatever you want, right? At the same time, I would say that the fact that these people know that they exist in and are beholden to another kind of infrastructure that they're involved in but is separate from them is also a really important way of thinking about our role in any kind of community healing process. These are the lessons that I take from this book. I also wanted to note that, there are all different kinds of ways in Conjure to approach the dead. People have varying skills, varying gifts, varying ideas. And that also, I think, emphasizes why the community is so essential. Somebody can talk to the dead, somebody can hear plants talk, somebody can do this, somebody can do that, somebody can mix herbs well. We need all hands on deck, right? That to me is just a really beautiful, beautiful idea. The last question is about when did I start writing about Southern Gothic literature and what drew me to it. I knew, always that I wanted to study the Black South in particular because that's where my people come from. And I was raised in Kansas, in Illinois, in Iowa, far away from the Deep South. And so the first opportunity that I had after I finished my PhD, I knew I was going straight to the South. And I've been there ever since so that I could live and work in and learn from this community. And part of what draws me to this world is, again, I think of the way that it imagines our entanglement, our responsibilities to one another. Southern Gothic writers know for a fact that we don't just exist on a realm distinct from one another. I'm here and you're here, and Ashley is here. We're all here together. One of the things that Southern Gothic, I think, is trying to do is to lay bare our claims to one another, what we owe one another, and what our responsibilities to one another are. I know I have just talked for a really super long time, but I just wanted to thank you again so much for your incredibly, incredibly smart and very thoughtful questions. I really, am extremely honored by how seriously you took my essay, and I really cannot thank you enough for taking the time to read it and to ask me these amazing questions. So yeah, it was wonderful having a chance to talk to you. And please be well.